Hello, folks. Thank you very much for having me. I was invited by Mr. Metcalf. He said that, because he said, would you like to come to DrupalCamp? And I was like, but I'm a front-ender. And he was like, yeah, but it's nice to get a bit of variety. So yeah, here I am. And I want to talk to you guys about pattern libraries, because that's kind of what I do most of the time. And hopefully there'll be something useful in it for you guys. How to make your back end love your front end. It's a bit misleading because I'm generally just going to be talking about the process I take to building pattern libraries. But because it was called DrupalCamp, I thought I needed a kind of clever name to tie into that. So yeah, a bit about me. I'm on Twitter at I am Keir. I've been freelancing since I was about 16. I registered self-employed on my 18th birthday. And I've been freelancing on and off for about 15 years. I was doing that while I was at university. I did that while I had full-time jobs, but I've always been freelancing. And during that time, I've been really lucky to work with some really wonderful clients and some brands and websites, as presented here. What's kept me kind of interested in web for that duration is just keeping my projects really varied. So, sometimes they can be very corporate, like British Cycling or, bigger corporate sites. And then stuff for Aardman is always very creative. And typically when I go in to do a project for Aardman, they show me the designs and I go, right. And I've got to figure out how I'm going to make these beautiful, art-directed things into an actual site that will work on mobile and things like that. So yeah, I kind of, in the last 5 years, I've specialised in building pattern libraries for large-scale websites. I've very much got on board with that as the kind of the most efficient, best way of, for me anyway, of building for large-scale websites. When I'm not doing that stuff, I do build e-commerce in Shopify. And I do like smaller client sites and stuff for friends using things like Perch, and I'm sure like a lot of you I like playing around with APIs, seeing what you can do with those as well. When I'm not in front of a laptop, I'm a snowboard instructor, which is super fun, and I think that maybe I'm going to be starting to move away from web and more to that. I used to be a breakdancer, and in one of my talks I did some breakdancing, and that really confused everyone, so I'm not going to do any breakdancing today. And I was, at one point in my life, a lemur ranger at Bristol Zoo, which is kind of maybe like a Power Ranger, but not as cool. And I've also got into various, I call misadventures, making daft videos, one of which went viral, which was doing 52 animal impressions using household items. So if that hasn't lowered the expectations of my talk, I don't know what will. So the first thing I wanted to ask was if I could get a show of hands of what you guys all do. So people who consider themselves primarily or solely back-end, could you raise a hand? Cool. And front-end? And UX design, and what does everyone else do that hasn't put up a hand? Like project management or like technical thing? Right, well, bottom line is there's quite a mix, so hopefully there'll be a little bit of usefulness to everyone. So the thing I want to start with, just so we're all on the same page, is what is a pattern library? I'm sure you guys have encountered them, you may be building them yourselves right now. They've become very fashionable, I guess, or very popular. And a lot of companies, they love to produce these beautiful pattern libraries that if you have any semblance of OCD in your character, you just look at and you're just like, everything's so organized, and it just makes you feel calm, or it makes me feel calm anyway. So yeah, I mean, I think of a pattern library as a kind of collection of, reusable user interface elements that make up the kind of building blocks or the pieces of a jigsaw that make up a larger scale site. Sometimes I'm not a fan of Bootstrap, as I'm sure Many people are, many people aren't. I mean, it's a very awesome resource, but I have in the past explained it to clients as a bespoke bootstrap. In other words, I'm going to build you something like Bootstrap, but it's going to be specific to your brand, it's going to be specific to your needs. But it's just a useful frame of reference if someone's like, what the hell's a pattern library? I love them for a number of reasons, because they're wonderfully logical. Things are, broken out into their smallest, most modular, basic parts. They're very consistent, and they keep the look and feel of a site very consistent across the board, because you're trying to keep that like consistent branding, feel, typography, all through all of those pieces. They're reusable. You can grab a module and you can put it anywhere, and you've almost got infinite. Well, no, you do. You have infinite ways you could link those together. But the thing that I think I like about them the most is that they're extensible. So if you've built a pattern library and you've built a site, this is especially important for me as a freelancer. When I move on, I need that code to be able to be given to the team. It may be an internal team, it may be another freelancer that comes along. And what I need is for that to be easy to join and extend as the site grows and it goes on in future. Because I think looking back a long time, maybe 10 years previous in my career, there was a real pattern of building a website, and then when a new person comes in or it's handed over to a team, it kind of just changes trajectory, it goes off in a different direction, and you're not really building on a foundation. You're kind of like, I don't know, throwing stuff at the wall and just seeing what sticks. So yeah, I like those for those reasons, but I consider it a very, very efficient way of building very large-scale sites. So it's changing that paradigm from thinking in terms of templates or pages into modules, and using the development time as efficiently as possible. As a freelancer, we don't come cheap, and so obviously I want to pay my bills, but I want to offer the greatest amount of value at the best possible cost to the clients. And if they said to me, right, we've got to build a 100-page website, and I charge them to build 100 pages, that's going to cost a fortune, and it's not the most efficient way. Whereas if you build a pattern library and you build modules, in fact, in the last 5 years, I've built more libraries than sites. So what I'm handing over is this library. 6 months later, I'll get an email and say the site's gone live, and I'll go along to it and online, and I'll be like, this is awesome. I haven't built this site. I've built the pieces of this site, but their internal developers have created the site, and I find that really satisfying, and I just think it's very efficient. And as I was saying before, it's a very solid foundation, and I think a really important part of that is the kind of global awareness it offers you. So again, previously when we were building pages or templates, I come in and I spot a page and they say, right, we want to change this, and I change it there. Who knows what's going to happen across the rest of the site? Am I breaking something? If I fix something here, am I breaking it somewhere else? When we use a pattern library and we think of it in that modular way, I can see the module in isolation. I can see all the variants of that particular module, and when I make a change, I can know how it's going to impact the whole site. So that kind of global awareness, I just think that's so valuable, especially if you're working in big teams and you're handing over to different team members a lot of the time. So yeah, I'm not going to go on about this bit too much, but there's lots and lots of pattern libraries in the wild. Some really iconic ones. The MailChimp one is quite a well-known one. Lonely Planet, they made one called Rizzo, which to me is kind of like it's just amazing. It's so clever. It's definitely worth a look. And there's a bunch of other ones there. The bristol.gov.uk one was one I worked with a company called CX Partners on. And who's aware of the work that the Gov UK stuff, the GDS stuff, yeah? So they did a massive kind of reworking of how they were going to launch digital across all of the monolithic services of the government. And that is a real poster child for a lot of companies. And the Bristol Council, they wanted to, take a lot from that to build their own one, which we did. But I think it's Anna Debenham and Brad Frost. They maintain a site called styleguides.io, which is great for inspiration. You can look through it all, just find loads of different ones, and just see how other people are doing it, really. So in terms of the process I go through for building a pattern library, it very much begins offline. So what I would typically do, much to the annoyance of the company I'm working for at the time, is I will commandeer a wall and I will print all the designs out, and they all go on the wall. And I guess I kind of romanticize that I'm like CSI Miami or something, and I'm looking at a crime board. And I step back, and I want to see the site as a whole, and I'm not looking at the finer detail. I'm almost like squinting. I want to see where I can see these similarities between things, and I'm getting a lay of the land. And that process of spotting patterns for me could take a couple of days. So it does make clients nervous because they're like, "Why aren't you coding?" And I'm like, "Don't worry, I've got a plan." But yeah, I think that time spent spotting patterns really sets the direction and the tone of the rest of the project. That kind of awareness of those patterns. There's no right and wrong way to build a pattern library or spot patterns. And actually, if you're doing it with someone, that can be really great because they may see patterns that you don't, and vice versa. And I try not to get bogged down in it because I really just want to, start picking out these patterns and, just to get a lay of the land, really. But it kind of takes a bit of what I'd say kind of lateral thinking, because patterns aren't just, it's got the same font or it's got the same this, that and the other. So for example, these are, I think I called these a hero, and they were spread across many different pages, but I wasn't so much looking at them being identical, I was just looking at these common traits. And so in this example here, they've all got a title, they've all got a bit of text, they may have an action link, they've got what I would say media, because it might be video rather than image, and we've got different ways of cropping those images. So to me, this one over in the right here, this is one that someone might not recognize as part of that pattern, and that's not wrong, but for me, it was just, these all were variations of a single module that I could build. And the same goes here. I don't know if there's someone wrote about something called a media element, which is basically text and a piece of media, which basically makes up more or less the whole of the web. But again, I'm trying to find these patterns. It could be a video, it could be an image, there might be a key line, there might be a background, there might be a caption. But spotting those across the board and bringing those into one module that can then have these variations I find it really fun, actually. Just going, could that be this, or is it that? No right and wrong. So the next part of the process for me is universal naming. This is so important because it's something that feeds across all teams. So it doesn't matter what you want to name things, but if you all agree, UX, front end, design, back end, the project managers, if you all agree a naming convention for your modules, everyone knows what the hell you're talking about when you go, the product listing's not working or the hero isn't working. Everyone knows. And the most powerful thing about that is it actually reduces a kind of cognitive overhead of development, because once we've all agreed a universal naming convention, I don't need to worry about my file names. I split it all out and they use the same module names. I don't need to worry about my class names. They are using the universal language. Who's heard of BEM, naming convention? Yeah, lots of people. So, if we've decided that a module's called hero and I've got BEM at my disposal, adding, basically I've namespaced and I don't have to think about it. I remember 5 years ago, I'd be like, what do I call this? Now I don't care. I just go, right, it's that, and off I go. And obviously, with that namespacing approach and that universal language, you're reducing conflicts. You're not going to get modules colliding because they've got their own distinct name. And I'm going to bang on about this. I always go the route of obvious, not clever. So sometimes people will go, okay, well, I've called this module, I don't know, hero list. And they might go, oh, you know what, actually, I'm going to shorten that to HL. Don't. Like, class names don't send a lot of data down the pipe. That if you're going to be verbose, do it in your words, and it just makes it simpler. You know, when someone else comes along, they don't have to go, what does HL stand for? You just know, and it's all consistent. Sometimes some projects I've worked on, we've even given them IDs. So on the left here, you can see some of these module names we've come up with, and just because there were so many, we actually gave them a kind of ID as well. But I would literally just put dashes in between these names, and they would be my class names, because why not? You know, everything is kind of, you know, logical and clear and obvious in that way. So after pattern spotting and coming up with a naming convention for all your modules, the next thing I do is I'll stick them into some form of board. Or people heard of Kanban board before? Maybe it's just a fancy name for essentially a kind of a workflow. So I would typically have my tasks, things that were blocked. You know, if I've got a question that needs to be answered before I can move on. Then I have next and now, so I know what I'm going to be working on next and what I'm currently working on, and then done or QA or whatever the process is after what you've done before it could come back to you. There's nothing clever about this, and I'm sure a lot of you already maybe use it in what you do already. But it's amazing how many agencies I go to that don't have anything like this. And if they don't, I will just set up a Trello for myself, and I'll say to them, do you want access to it? I don't care if you do, it's just for me, it's useful. And they can see, you know, how things are going. But when you're working as a team, it's great because you pick a card, you add your team, your name label to it, and then you stick it in the now, and then anyone can, at any point can see, oh, well, so-and-so is working on this module, I'm working on that module. But what I typically put into a card is if I've put all of those designs on the wall, I'll take a photo of a particular module, and I will upload that to the card, and there'll obviously be a functional spec with each module that I've either discussed with people or I've been given. That goes into the card, and then I'll put some time estimates by it. And most of these pieces of software allow you to kind of total up your time, which is great because I can, at any point, a project manager can say to me, "Oh, how are we doing?" And I say, "Well, here's how much time I've spent. Here's how much time I've got left to do." And all the modules, they just go through the pipe. It's a good system for me. I think basically the point of this is that when you begin to think in a modular pattern library based way, almost everything you do across the board becomes modular, you know, every part of the process. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm waffling. So the anatomy of a pattern library for me is generally quite similar each time. So I tend to have what I'd call core, and that'll be all the stuff that is underpinning the pattern library. So in this example, I've got buttons, my fonts, global stuff will just be like the body, HTML, layout, which might be width helpers or a grid system, stuff relating to media, which would be images, iframes, videos, etc., typography, and print. And that is what I do first, because the way I build a pattern library is I start as generic as possible, and then as I develop, I get more and more specific. So a really specific module like a header or a footer is something that is done very late in the project, and something like this is what I do very early on, because if I get the typography right at square one, that's taken care of. I can forget about it. If I get the typography wrong at the beginning, I build a whole load of modules, and then I come back and tweak the typography. I've got to go back through all my modules and make sure I haven't broken stuff, so it's a bit of a pain if you were to do it that way. After that, there's many different ways of approaching this. You could take a very, very simple approach of having your core stuff and then modules, and that's all. Or you can go down the route of, there's the chap, Brad Frost, who does a lot of stuff with pattern libraries. He has something called atomic design. And it's fascinating, but I find it a bit overwhelming, where he actually breaks down a pattern library into literally, I think it's like atoms, molecules, component, all this stuff. And the problem for me is, as I said earlier, obvious, not clever. I'm not saying it's not clever, but if I have to think to figure something out, then I've put in a slight barrier to the progress of the project. But something that has been quite common in a lot of the projects I've worked on is these two in the middle, like widgets and rows, or modules and composites. Now, what that is a module for me is something very independent on its own, but a composite or a row is when we take a couple of modules and we bring them together. You could argue that that's a module. It's a module that contains modules, which is fine. But just sometimes in a project we've broken it out this way. So, you might, in a composite, you might see a couple of different modules in that context. Tools. So there are a million different ways of setting up a pattern library and how you want to handle your Sass or less or whatever CSS post or pre-processor you're using, how you want to concatenate your JavaScript, whether you're using like Webpack or includes or whatever. I personally use Grunt or Gulp, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, but I know people that use Jekyll, Handlebars, PHP. You can roll your own. I told you I was going to bang on about this. Obvious, not clever. The more clever your kind of framework becomes, the greater the barrier to entry. And as a freelancer, it's really important that I can just hand something over and very easily people can just get started. You want it to be ideally agnostic. So, using something like PHP is going to require, Apache or some kind of web server that's going to be serving PHP. If someone, these days that's quite easy to set up, but the point is it's still a extra step that is required. I use Grunt, and that requires, Node and things like that, and that can still go wrong. So I always think it's a trade-off. Whatever tools you're using is fine, but make sure, if nothing else, you've got to README, because, if that's, it's just really annoying if you hand over the code, especially if I'm handing over the front-end stuff to back-end teams and they want to integrate it. They just want to get going. They don't want to be going, I need to install this, and then I need to give permissions to that, and it's just a nightmare. So, obvious, not clever, keep it simple. Two to have a look at if you're interested is Brad Frost's patternlibrary.io, and Clear Left made one called Fractal. Both really cool and worth a look. This is my other mantra, as well as obvious, not clever, is simple rarely breaks, but if it does, simple is easy to fix. So that goes across everything that I'm talking about. It goes across the tooling, it goes across your approach, it goes across the naming conventions. I just really like keeping things simple. So, testing. Pattern libraries are great for testing as well. In my experience, when I've built pattern libraries, testers have loved me because they can test modules in isolation, which is very useful, and they can be testing quite early on in the project. Typically, we build a whole load of stuff, we give it to QA, hundreds of stuff goes wrong, or maybe a few, but that's very rare, and it comes back to you. And it's a little bit like when you build a big project, and then you show the client very late on in the process. That great reveal, basically you've just stacked up so much stuff that there's a greater chance of there being a lot of feedback. So what I've often done in projects is, as a module is completed, it gets pushed into the done or the QA column. The QA people get started straight away. They're testing it. That can then loop back in to your tasks. You might have a column that says bugs from QA, And that can be informing you of a bug that is actually going to be influencing the other modules you're building. So you've created a kind of develop test cycle that can be running the whole time that you're building, and that's great because I'm sure everyone's heard people get overexcited about agile. Rather than this kind of design, front end, back end, QA, you're starting to merge that and create a bit of a cycle, which is great. And if you're into your unit testing, pattern libraries are great for that too, because you've got a very isolated, clear test case in each particular module. So handing over, this is the bit where it actually links somewhat to my original title. When I'm building pattern library, I'm always thinking about where it goes after me. More often than not, it's obviously going to the back-end team to be integrated. And very often, back-end teams maybe don't have any front-end skill. And rightly so, potentially, because that's not what they need to focus on. So what I'm trying to do is give to them something that they can just integrate and not have to worry about. Now that is typically just an export or a build of the HTML, the CSS and the JavaScript. But there's kind of like little finer things that a front-ender can do to make life easier for the back-end team. And that could be, for example, if I've got like a listing, maybe it's got date order and alphabetical ordering, and I'm using Ajax. Ajax is always the pain because it's always like, no, it's your responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. But I want to team up with the back-end team and make sure that what I'm producing is just really easy for them. And that can be as simple as data attributes. So if I'm using data attributes in my code, I'll populate them with some fake data. But what I would do is then hand that to the back-end team and say, look, all you need to do is spit out the data that's coming from the back-end into these data attributes, and it will just work. That is an example of how to make back-end love your front-end, because it's just easy for them. They don't have to send emails and say, why is this not working, all the rest of it. The other thing that I often, or I think is really important is my earlier slide where I had some links to some pattern libraries. These are kind of these super beautiful pattern libraries. It looks like a designer has designed the pattern library. Pattern libraries in the real world on fast-flowing projects, especially as a freelancer, don't have to be pretty. They just need to be functional. So I'm just going to jump out of my presentation quickly. So for example, the MailChimp one, it's very nicely designed, it looks beautiful. The Bristol City Council one is, very attractive. But a real world one for me might look like that. Because there isn't any time to design it, and it's not for public facing, so it doesn't matter. So it's just the very basics. But what is important is usage and notes. So not only are you presenting all the modules, you need to explain, in the case of buttons, there isn't much to say, but for example, if we jump over to this one here, this is the ability to set and unset cookies via links. Nothing is visually happening, but I've gone on to explain how it works and how to use it. That took 5 minutes, but to integration team or when you're handing over to other people, that is absolutely crucial. And yeah, I think that's really important with pattern libraries. So it doesn't need to be beautiful, but it does need to be informative. Resume. I'm still mirroring displays. there's another thing as well, is thinking, when you're building the front end, thinking about how the back-end system will be managed by content editors and things like that. So there's a link here to an article by Edu, who are originally Sift, and it's called Content Slices. And I think in the most recent version of Drupal, and it's certainly true of when I've worked with Umbra Code developers as well, is you can have a very kind of row-based way of managing the content in the back end. And so often we'll build out these, from an earlier slide when I was talking about the rows or the composites, we'd build out these content slices which contain various modules, and it does allow the people who are managing the back end to create any version of any page using these modules. The other thing that's really important in terms of the handover is how to have the pattern library become part of your workflow, because what can happen is a front ender can build a pattern library, it goes to integration, the site goes live. Then some changes come in, or some new pages or new modules are needed. And the pattern library is kind of left to rot, because it's like, well, that was fine for the setup, but now that we're kind of running through, we just need to get into the system and we need to get it set up. This is kind of a bit of a holy grail of pattern libraries. It's a problem that everyone's trying to solve, and it's not an easy one. Because what you really need to do is have, CX Partners, a guy called Stu there, he came up with this kind of, well, he didn't come up with it, but he's got an article talking about it, where you kind of want your pattern library and production to be using the same point of data, in terms of the modules. So you want to kind of loop back into that front end process, build the new modules, the changes you need, and then push that back through into integration. And you kind of need that workflow to be created such that the pattern library remains useful, and not just this thing over on the side. The way this is solved a lot of the time is kind of using like a data API. So, that could be handlebars, it could be anything. But it's essentially saying, look, I've got my markup, and I've got my backend, and I've got my data. And if you can separate those out, that means you can pump fake data into the pattern library, and you can pump real live data into the backend system using the same front end. Rizzo is a really good, that's the Lonely Planet one. That's one to go and have a look at if you want to see a kind of really clever, interesting way of doing it. It's a problem that needs to be solved, but again, bleating on about being obvious, not clever, it's a trade-off, because when you start going down that route, things can start getting a bit kind of complicated. How am I doing for time? Got maybe 10 minutes, okay. So just a few kind of gotchas. The pattern libraries are not always appropriate. I don't use a pattern library for every single thing I build. I try, but if I start to encounter problems or reasons why that can't be the case, then I'm not gonna fight that battle. So for example, this site here, it's a super kind of unique, interactive design, and as a result, it doesn't really lend itself to a pattern library. It's not necessarily big enough either. I've still got my buttons and my typography and all that stuff, but there would be no real reason for me to make a pattern library for that. And the same goes for a lot of admin sites. When they're so heavily designed and art directed, a pattern library is not necessarily the correct way to go. Not always appropriate. One thing I've always had to manage with clients, especially as a freelancer, is building a pattern library can be very slow to start with, but then it's very much an increasing returns approach. So by the end of the project, you are firing out modules, you know, just like crazy. And that can sometimes need to be managed with your team, with the expectations from project managers, because they're like, you know, where's the site? Have you built it yet? And you know, you've been on the project for a week and you spent 2 days staring at a wall and you spent 3 days building buttons, and they're kind of getting a bit anxious. But you just need to reassure them that that's how it goes, and that's going to just be the process that takes. The other thing is getting buy-in. You know, some companies, clients that aren't using this approach can get a bit nervous. They're like, oh, I don't know, you know. So you just need to convince them that that's the way that you think is the right way to go about it. Show them examples and talk about those benefits. Another little gotcha is what I call style collide. So let's say I've got a button and then I've got a module, and I put the button in that module, but in that particular module the button looks a certain way. Where does the style go? Is that a modification that should be in the module, or is that a modification that should be in the button, or should it be in both? I tend to create it in the button because I want to be able to see them all in one place. So if I had a very, very specific requirement of a button in a particular module, I might call that, using BEM, button -- the name of the module. So I know that this is a button that changes accordingly in this specific environment. It's not perfect. There's a trade-off between both of them, but it's something to be aware of, is where do you put your styles? As usual, obvious, not clever. And I kind of talked about the workflow, you know, not letting it die and rotting. And somebody asked me the other day, what's the difference between a pattern library, a design system, and a style guide? Semantics. People will often say that style guide is more brand orientated. It might be something that designers do. It's not necessarily totally focused on code. It might be focused around UX. It might be focused on how you deliver things across different devices. But largely, I call them pattern libraries. You can call them whatever you want. You know, as long as you're solving a problem, you know, it doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as all the people involved in the project agree. You know, as long as you go, right, this is what we're going to call it. There you go, just to hammer it home one more time. So yeah, that's kind of the approach I take to building pattern libraries. Hopefully that's kind of useful. I just wanted to say, have this slide because Brad Forth, Alan Debenham and Harry Roberts, they do a lot of work. Their articles about pattern libraries and front end in general is just so good. So if you spot an article that pops up from one of them, read it. It'll definitely be useful. And some of the various agencies I've worked with that have kind of helped me learn to build pattern libraries and such like. So yeah, hopefully that was insightful.